because I literally am like holding onto the mic for dear life.
You should let me love you.
Feel like I could like give myself a hug, you know, and be like, it's okay, bro.
What's going on, everyone? It's Anthony Aiken Jr. And for the first time in 6 years, I believe, Zayn did an interview. He was on the Call Her Daddy podcast. We have so much to discuss. And the number one thing I got from this interview is that Zayn is escaping this mystique, okay? This notion that he's mysterious and serious all the time. Can't define someone to one personality trait. We are more complex than that. And he said that when describing his time with One Direction. And what I found interesting, he mentioned Simon Cowell. And he says, and this is something that I've never heard before, and I feel like Zayn placed an emphasis on this just by mentioning it. Simon Cowell created the Teletubbies and the Power Rangers. I did not know that. My mind was blown when he said that. I'm telling my kids this was the Power Rangers. I don't care what y'all say. Power Rangers! But it makes so much sense because I used to watch both those shows growing up, and all the characters had one color and one personality trait. They were all one-dimensional, but it was with the purpose that you can take one of those characters and you can relate to it in some way. And that's what made the marketing so genius. And One Direction was kind of assembled like that, where, okay, cool, you have the charm, you have the mysterious quiet one. And Zayn, he mentions that he always had to be placed under this serious box, right? And he's more complex than that, as he mentions. But what I love, and this was probably my favorite line from the interview, he says, I feel like we get to a certain point in adult life where everything is kind of vague, gray, and boring, and she brought that color back to me, referring to his daughter.
Rekindled my own childhood, like through her, you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like we get to a certain point in adult life where everything's kind of vague and grey and boring, and she's brought that colour back for me, for sure.
First and foremost, that was so poetic, you know, the whole world being a dark cloud, being grey, and then his daughter looking at Zayn as if he's a rainbow, like full of light, iridescent. And that's beautiful. And you can see in the interview that he showcased so much more than what the media's narrative has created for him. So now that I got that out the way, let's talk about what he opened up about. So he starts off by mentioning Pennsylvania, okay? From my understanding, he was in New York for a long time. I was born and raised in New York. New York is very fast-paced. There's a lot going on, and it's a media circus. So if you're a celebrity, I can only imagine what that's like, especially in Manhattan. In Pennsylvania, I've been to Pennsylvania. I've been to Hershey Park. I used to love that area. And it's very quiet. There's a lot of trees, a lot of nature, and very beautiful homes. I guess Zayn, moved to Pennsylvania not only for his own experience, but for his daughter to have the option to be away from the spotlight, to be away from fame and paparazzi. And therefore, it gives her a choice once she becomes aware that this is Zayn's life. She can choose, okay, I want to live a more peaceful, quiet life, or maybe I do want to go down that road, because he does mention she's a great singer, and we'll get into that later on. But speaking of Pennsylvania, right, I want to shout out the host of Call Her Daddy, because I'd never seen this podcast before, but I know about the controversy involving like the drama between another host that had left. And I feel like I looked at it a certain way, like, okay, Call Her Daddy is rowdy and all this, but she was very down to earth in this interview. And I think by her filming this in her childhood home in Pennsylvania, and just you see her sitting pretzel style on the couch, it created a very comforting setting. And you can tell Zayn was an open book all throughout the interview. I thought she conducted this interview amazing.
Anything in my mind is trying to be a good example to her. That's why I'm even doing this interview, you know, like I used to get a lot of anxiety around having a conversation like this, and I want her to be able to look at me and be like, yo, my dad's doing this.
The funniest moment from this interview, I wonder if y'all agree, was he mentioned he has 3 cats, 3 dogs, and then he mentioned like chickens, but he took his chicken to the vet because something was wrong with it.
Oh God!
I took my chicken to the vet to get a scan because something was wrong with her, and the vet laughed at me and said, "People don't bring chickens here."
Yo, Zayn, I hope you're doing all right. He said he doesn't name his chickens because he doesn't want to grow a personal attachment to the chicken. And I feel that. But obviously, a lot of people wanted to know his thoughts on, I guess, his time with One Direction because people have a fascination with it. And I learned something. A lot of y'all are wrong. Now, let me break it down. He mentions about One Direction. I don't think I comprehended it at all. I think it's just a rush. It was fun. Repetitive fun over and over again begins to take its toll. He doesn't necessarily remember those emotions during his time with One Direction. He's only able to reflect on what it is, 10, 11, 12 years later. But you can tell there is a heightened level of appreciation from Zayn about those One Direction years. And one other thing I learned, right? Because when Zayn left One Direction, and this is just from my understanding, everyone kind of put the blame on him. Like, okay, he's leaving for his selfish reasons. It's his fault. And all these things. They made him out to be the bad boy. But he mentions in this interview that he can foreshadow the end of One Direction due to political reasons and specifically contractual reasons.
There was a lot of politics going on. Certain people were doing certain things, certain people didn't want to sign contracts. So I knew something was happening. So I just got ahead of the curve. If I'm being honest with you, I was like, I'm just going to get out of here. I think this is done. And I just seen it. And I completely selfishly wanted to be the first person to go and make my own record.
He took that leap of faith and was like, you know what? I want to be the first one to leave because eventually everyone's going to leave. So I might as well get out first.
Look around you. Look at this. We created this. This didn't exist before we were here.
But him describing it as being ahead of the curve and just looking at how things panned out, right? Like people always say, when you talk about Made in the AM, right? They mention in the lyrics, like, this is the end. Like, it screams, this is the end. So it just makes me think either two things would have happened. If Zayn would have stayed with the group, Made in the AM probably would have sounded a little bit better, because Zayn would be singing the high notes. But eventually, somebody was going to leave and go solo. And if it wasn't going to be Zayn, it was going to be either Harry, Niall, Liam, or Louis. Like, one of them were going to depart, regardless. I have my guesses on who would have, though. But the thing I love, and I'm glad he mentioned it, he said he wasn't stressing about the reaction. Like, yes, there was a huge reaction. It was like this.
The big news today is that One Direction, one of the band members, is leaving.
What? What? Did you hear One Direction is breaking up?
What?
She just told me.
Hold the phone.
Zayn is leaving the band.
Zayn!
The only person he really cared about was his family. Like, he didn't care about what the reaction was because at the end of the day, he doesn't have to deal with y'all on a day-to-day basis. Now, his family, that's different. And he mentions, like, he called his mom up and was like, hey, do you have a bed for me? If I were to leave the band, is there going to be a bed for me? Which I think is absolutely adorable. Like, that's your number one worry.
I just called her on that day and that I was leaving and said, I'm coming home. Is it okay? Have you still got a bed for me? And she was like, yeah.
Stop.
The interview goes on, he mentions, he's witty, he loves dad jokes. Him and his daughter is starting to sing. She plays instruments. She has a great music knowledge at the age of 2.5 years old, and they sing in unison, which I think is amazing. Like, I could just the sound of Zayn's voice and a baby voice like that would be the greatest interlude on an album. But like I mentioned, that one quote where he says, I feel like we get to a certain point in adult life where everything is kind of vague, gray, and boring, and she brought that color back for me. I really do think it's the most important line in the interview, and I hope that turns into like some sort of lyric on the album, because you can tell that he has this sense of urgency to be that rainbow for his daughter, you know. And I think the same way, and you can connect the two, right? Him leaving One Direction and then instantly calling his mom to almost get her approval, like, hey, is there a bed for me? Like, you know, and is it okay if I come home? And his mom being okay with it, right? You could tell that mattered to him. And the same thing that gave him the confidence and the courage to leave that situation and kind of fall back a bit from fame is the same thing that's kind of bringing him back to the spotlight in a sense, and kind of giving him that urgency to get back on stage and perform and tour. And that's his daughter. It's family. So you can tell that his priority is family. It's rooted in that. It's not rooted in superficial things. It's not rooted in fame, money, celebrity. It's rooted in family, and also I would say and standing on something that's bigger than him. And I think that's what I find so amazing, is that Zayn is finally returning to the stage. He kind of hinted at it. And he mentioned like, yo, his fans have been holding it down and sticking by him despite him not really touring or being active like that. But the fact that he is at least thinking about getting back on stage makes me so happy. And as for the family controversy, when it's a touchy subject like that, sometimes you have to answer the question you're asking in the question so that the person that has to answer feels less pressure to come up with an answer because it's kind of already given, if that makes sense. And she kind of mentions it here where it's like, you know, look, you clearly have 50% custody of your child with no limitations. So that answers everybody's question.
I believe I dealt with it in the best way, like in an amicable, respectful way, and that's all that needs to be said, you know?
All in all, I think this interview was amazing. I got a lot of great things from it. I learned a lot about Zayn from it. I would love to hear Zayn's dad jokes someday. And I'm so excited for his new single. So we'll be right back here in about, a week and a half. Definitely check out my other videos on Zayn. Some of my favorite videos on the channel have been centered around Zayn. And yeah, there'll be more coming soon. So like, comment, subscribe. My social media is Anthony96JR. And as always with my channel, we end off with a hug. Bring it in.
I prefer speaking in analogies. Reality is never my fatality. You show me your true colors and I paint you in my gallery. You smoking on the windowsill, I'm plotting on the hazardy. I had to have you back with power, baby. I'm the battery pack. Only in town for a bit, but I'm glad to be back. It's calamity with family genetics, as in genes. What's the code? Cause I'm trying to be the jacket to match. If I am, then we both warm, hopeful, and young. They throw shade, but I'm Icarus, I'm close to the sun. We